So yet another video of an Israeli soldier parading around in Palestinian women's...
Why indeed do IOF soldiers continue dressing up in the underwear of the people they've killed and destroyed their homes, despite recent directives from the IDF to not do that kind of thing? This isn't me disagreeing with Chris's video. I think his take was great, and he brought in Frantz Fanon quotes about how this is a feature of colonialism. I just want to add in another way of thinking about this behavior through a historical lens, because we can look at how there's a European tradition of justifying land grabs, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid with sexual humiliation going back at least to the 16th century. And in particular, Christian church leaders from both Protestant faiths and the Catholic Church weaponize sexual humiliation to justify land grabs and power grabs from three vulnerable groups in strikingly similar ways. And those three groups were Jews, sex workers, and nuns. This is my Roman Empire, and I promise you don't know all of this history. So for context, in the 16th century, Europe is reeling from a massive power shift because of the Protestant Reformation. In countries that go Protestant, the nobles there are able to seize huge amounts of land that had previously been owned by the Catholic Church. In Nuns, A History of Convent Life, Silvia Evangelisti details how nuns were targeted by Protestants in these countries. Their land was seized, they were displaced, in some places executed. And Protestants justified this land grab by regarding monks and nuns as men and women who devoted themselves to idleness, gluttony, and dubious social morality, and convents were often compared to brothels. From my book, according to medieval logic, if nuns were sluts, then Protestant nobles were justified in stealing their property and displacing them to Catholic lands. Unfortunately for these nuns, when they get to Catholic lands, they find themselves in the midst of another land grab being conducted by their own religious brothers. Because in the 16th century, because of this Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church is incredibly threatened, right? It's hemorrhaging land and power. And so it looks inward to the land it still controls and looks and says, who can we seize power and land from here within the domains we still control? And they landed on Jews, sex workers, and nuns, including those nuns who had just fled from Protestant countries. I'll read to you a little bit from my book, Genocide Bad, Notes on Palestine, Jewish History, and Collective Liberation, where I go into all of this history in greater detail. In the 16th century, Catholic Church leaders were fighting back against the reputation of the Italian peninsula as a place where both Jews and sex workers had previously experienced comparatively high levels of wealth and freedom. Prior to their ghettoization in the 16th century, Jews had owned vineyards and orchards across the peninsula, and others amassed wealth as textile traders. Meanwhile, historian Antony Majak, in this book, Travel in Early Modern Europe, details how visitors from Northern Europe were astounded by the freedom and wealth, charm and elegance of the courtesans of Venice in the early modern period. For Venetian nobles, only the eldest sons were allowed to marry in order to prevent family wealth from being split among too many descendants. Thus, unofficial relationships between the younger sons of noble families and courtesans allowed these women to amass a wealth, independence, and status that was unheard of for women throughout European Christendom. Majak explains that the high status of sex workers was not limited to Venice. Because of the high concentration of priests in Rome who were forbidden to marry, there was an amazingly low population of women there, and of those women who did live in Rome, a high proportion were sex workers, whose clientele included all those priests who were forbidden to marry. Majak explains that pious pilgrims traveling to Rome were scandalized, quote, to see cardinals, bishops, and Spanish prelates sitting in the first row of the theater stalls alongside Rome's most celebrated Spanish courtesans on Easter Sunday, end quote. When the Catholic Church was the only religious power in Europe, they could get away with this flaunting of sexual hypocrisy. But now that the Protestant Reformation was threatening them, they had to crack down on any sort of charges of sexual impurity, and that crackdown landed particularly hard on nuns and sex workers. Jews ended up getting folded into all this sexual humiliation because the Catholics wanted their land. For nuns, this authoritarian crackdown and land grab came in the form of strict laws of enclosure. I'll read you a little more about that from my book. Before the Council of Trent, nuns were able to be a part of the surrounding community, move about the secular world, and participate in economic activity. Nuns owned land, farmed, and ran shops and businesses, such as apothecaries and goat farms. But following the Tridentine reforms, as these laws of enclosures, male church leaders stole the nuns' land and imprisoned them for life within the walls of their convents. After enclosure, if the convent grounds contained a cemetery, a girl might enter a convent knowing she would never again emerge even after death. Throughout the 16th century, male church reformers insisted the walls of convents be built higher and topped with spikes. They installed grills on all the windows and turned convents into Renaissance-era max security prisons in the name of protecting the virtue of nuns. At the exact same time on the Italian peninsula, Jews are having all of their land stolen by Christian nobles and Catholic Church leaders, and they're being forced into tiny, cramped, walled ghettos. A little more from my book. Can you think of what rhymes with this history in 2025? Once you've stolen someone's land, what are you going to do with them? How will you control them? Put them behind a wall, top the gates with spikes, don't let them out at any cost. Sounds like the siege of Gaza to me. Okay, but what do Jewish ghettos, nuns being trapped in their convents, have to do with sexual humiliation and IOF soldiers in 2025 dressing up in Palestinian women's underwear? I'm getting to that. As the Catholic Church is cracking down on nuns and Jews, they're also cracking down on these high-class courtesans, which are essentially like sex workers for nobles. And across the Italian peninsula, one of the ways that Jews and sex workers are targeted at the same time is through the sudden enforcement of a wearable badge. So this is from Dress Codes, How the Laws of Fashion Made History. Fashion historian Richard Thompson details how across Italy, Jews and sex workers in the early modern period were required to wear similar badges, a move designed to otherize and humiliate both groups and serve as a wearable ghetto that would follow them outside the physical confines of walled Jewish ghettos and red light districts. Ford explains, in the 15th century, Roman Jewish women were required to wear a red overskirt that prostitutes also wore. Jewish women in other parts of Italy had to wear a yellow veil, a sign of the prostitute in Italian cities from the 14th through the 16th centuries. In 1397, a Venetian law required Jews to wear a yellow badge, and a 1416 law required prostitutes and pimps to wear a yellow scarf. In Viterbo, any Jewish woman who dared appear on the streets without her yellow veil could be stripped naked by the first person to apprehend her, the same punishment prescribed in other cities for prostitutes who strayed from the districts where they were allowed to solicit customers. So in my mind, the sexual humiliation of medieval Jewish women rhymes with the rash of social media posts by IOF soldiers over the past year in which they dress up in the clothes and lingerie of Palestinian women. And in particular, this punishment for Jewish women in Viterbo of being stripped naked in the street sure echoes with the frequent practice by IOF soldiers of mass arresting civilians in Gaza, stripping them to their underwear, blindfolding them, and exposing them to the elements. And here's the conclusion I come to in my book. European history contains a long tradition of justifying land grabs by portraying the women who live there as sluts, blaming victims of violence for their own assault on the basis of the victim's alleged promiscuity is a hallmark of what feminist scholars term rape culture, a society where sexual assault is normalized and trivialized. Justifying the genocide of women based on the contents of their underwear drawers is an extreme conclusion of the same type of logic that asks, what were you wearing when someone reports a sexual assault? Now, Israel and other Western nations don't have a monopoly on rape culture by any means, but Israel is particularly afflicted by rape culture. Israeli forces and settlers have weaponized rape against Palestinians since the formation of the State of Israel. And Jewish Israeli citizens are also endangered by rape culture. A third of female soldiers in the IOF report sexual harassment on the job. 1 in 5 Israeli women report having been raped in their lifetimes, and nearly half of those reported assaults were committed against minors. Kind of ran out of time at the end of the video to wrap it all up. For 300 years, Jewish women were forced on the Italian peninsula to wear sexualized clothing that was the same clothing that all prostitutes and sex workers were forced to wear. And this clothing was seen as the justification for why their land had been stolen and why they were ghettoized, why they were trapped within tiny walled ghettos. This painting I showed you yesterday, this is from 1870, which is 70 years after Napoleon took over the Italian peninsula and ended these fashion laws for Jews, finally, for the last time. But still, 70 years later, this painter paints a Jewish woman. What does he do? He puts her in a red skirt, the same skirt prostitutes wore. He puts her in a yellow scarf, the same scarf that prostitutes had to wear. This is sexualized clothing they were legally forced to wear to humiliate them. And as I explained in that video, to humiliate both these noble courtesans who were these independently wealthy, incredibly free and liberated women, and made them wear it, made, the poor working class street prostitutes wear it, and made all Jewish women wear it, so that all of them could be humiliated and treated as a subgroup below all Christian women. And in rape culture, which is what Europe is, right? What Europe had been working on for many hundreds of years at this point already. In rape culture, you blame the victims of oppression for their, the victims of sexual assault, the victims of oppression are blamed for that oppression because of promiscuity. Well, how do you make a vulnerable, picked on population appear promiscuous? You put them in sexualized clothing. You flaunt their sexualized clothing. Flaunt their sexualized clothing as a justification for what you've done. So if you're not from the European tradition, you might not see that boom, boom. You might not understand that justification. You might not look at this painting with the associations of red skirt means Jew, also means prostitute. Yellow headscarf means Jew and prostitute. And think of how humiliating that was, that association was enforced upon Jewish people for 300 years. So that 70 years later, a painter could very easily reference it. It hadn't been forgotten by 1870. Even though I think many Jews have forgotten this history now, it's still in the subconscious somewhere. The logic of sexualized clothing means you could do whatever to a people. Like, that is still in there. You see what I'm saying? And then we had this law in Viterbo where prostitutes and Jewish women, if they were caught not wearing their headscarf, could be stripped naked in the street. Stripped naked in the street. European Jews learned this in Europe. They learned this there. This was done to them. Sexual humiliation justifies oppression. That is the European early modern and medieval logic. And then I threw in the nuns to that video because the same thing, as the Jews are being ghettoized because they're sluts, right? And that association between Jewishness and prostitution is being enforced through these dress codes. The same thing happens to nuns, just to show how ridiculous it is and to show the similarities, right? Everyone's saying, oh, nuns are sluts, because some nuns at the time, they had boyfriends in the monasteries. Yeah, they were sneaking out at night. They were fraternizing. What you don't understand about nuns in the 16th century is these weren't devout girls chosen, called to a life of devotion. These were just second and third daughters. Most families only had the money to marry off one daughter. If they were unfortunate enough to have 2 or 3 daughters, then the church was like a discount bargain bin, a discount sale that you could sell your younger daughters to. And starting in the 16th century, it meant selling them into a dungeon, into a max security prison, because the Catholic Church wanted to steal all the land and wealth that these nuns had accumulated throughout the Italian peninsula and the Holy Roman Empire and other areas. The enclosure laws were enforced more and less strictly everywhere. And what was the justification for locking up, in some places it was like 25%, 30% of women would be nuns at this time. All of them locked down max security as far as the 16th century is concerned. Never to emerge from their convent walls again. And why? Because they were sluts. Sexual humiliation justifies incarceration, justifies ghettoization, justifies apartheid, justifies land grab. That is the logic. Sure, it's a kink, it's a perversion, sure, it's a fantasy, but it's also, when they're doing this, they're saying, look, see, we're justified in what we did here. All this destruction, there's some part of their brain that is unhealed, hundreds, centuries and centuries of trauma in Europe. In some part of their brain, all this destruction and killing and violence is justified by this red lingerie. And this is where they learned it. These insights and more in Genocide Bad, Notes on Palestine, Jewish History and Collective Liberation, coming out March 11th with Interlink Press, the only Palestinian-owned publisher in the US. You can and should pre-order it now from the links in my bio. Only way to get your hands on an early physical copy of the book is to enter to win this week's giveaway by supporting Mohammed Hamad. He's a disabled teen in Gaza. His leg was shattered in the early part of the G word. $30,000 from his original campaign was stolen from him. And we're trying to raise that money back. We're close. We're almost 25% of the way there. He's already gotten 2,000 of these funds transferred, and that allowed him to hire a truck to take him back to his home in northern Gaza. He reached it yesterday. Posted pictures to his stories, though, thanking all of us, but also showing us that it is completely rubble. So right now his needs are survival, rebuilding, and hopefully someday treatment so that he can actually get his leg healed correctly and he's not in constant chronic pain. So to raise this money, we're doing a giveaway. If you donate at least $5, but please as much as you are able, to Muhammad's campaign, which you'll find here in my link tree. Go ahead and donate, and then you're going to send a screenshot of that receipt to t4gaza@gmail.com. The giveaway ends tomorrow. I don't know if there's going to be another one because I honestly don't know how many early copies of the book I'm going to get. So this may be your only chance to get an early copy. I would love to get this number to 10,000 by tomorrow. That would be really cool. We'd be a third of the way there to recuperating the funds that were stolen from him. But don't count on the giveaway to make sure you get your copy. Pre-order Genocide Bad at the links in my bio. But don't count on the giveaway to make sure you got your copy. Pre-order Genocide Bad and tell a friend. Tell a friend about how excited you are about this book. Maybe tell the internet if you're a content creator. That'd be cool. Or tell us in the comments. If you thought this was interesting, engage. Push all the buttons. I love you. You're amazing. You're my mishpacha.